I'm Allison Hansen, 36 years old, and I spent 14 years in Naval Intelligence, planning operations that saved lives in rooms I'll never be able to talk about. For 4 years, my mother-in-law called me a secretary, a liar, and told anyone who'd listen that I wasn't good enough for her son. But when she stood up at my brother-in-law's rehearsal dinner and screamed, "Get her out of here," in front of everyone, including a Navy SEAL who'd served under me, everything changed. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who never bothered to learn who you really are? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to hold your ground when the people closest to you tried to tear you down, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about standing tall and setting boundaries. What happened at that dinner might surprise you. I grew up in a house where silence was the highest form of respect. My father, Senior Chief Petty Officer Tom Hansen, served 28 years in the United States Navy and never once told us what he did. Not at dinner, not on holidays. Not even when my older brother Danny asked him point blank on the 4th of July, the summer before he shipped off to Paris Island. My father just looked at him, took a sip of his beer, and said, "You'll understand when you get there." That was it. That was the whole answer. We lived in base housing near the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. A 2-story duplex with a chain-link fence and a yard that my mother kept perfect because she said the condition of your lawn told people everything they needed to know about the condition of your family. My mother, Linda Hansen, taught 4th grade at an elementary school off Route 2. She was 5'3" and ran that classroom like a carrier flight deck. My father used to say she was the toughest person in the house, and he wasn't joking. I was the middle child. Danny was 3 years older, enlisted in the Marines the day after high school graduation, became an infantry officer, deployed twice to Iraq before he was 26. My younger sister Katie was 4 years behind me, quiet, gentle, became a nurse at Johns Hopkins. And then there was me, Allison Hansen, the one who sat at the kitchen table every night reading her father's old Naval Institute magazines. Not because anyone told her to, but because the world they described, the precision, the stakes, the invisible work that held everything together, felt like home before I even knew what home meant. I went to the University of Virginia on an NROTC scholarship. Studied international relations. I wasn't the loudest midshipman in the unit. That was a guy named Davis, who told everyone he was going to be a fighter pilot and ended up in supply. I was the one who stayed late in the intelligence lab, reading cable traffic for class exercises and finding patterns nobody else saw. My instructor, a retired Navy captain named Hargrove, pulled me aside in my junior year and said, "Hansen, you see the battlefield before it forms. Don't waste that." I didn't. I commissioned as an ensign in the spring of 2011. My father drove down from Annapolis for the ceremony. He didn't make a speech. He didn't cry. He walked up to me after, pinned my bars on my collar, and shook my hand like I was one of his sailors. His grip was firm, and his eyes were steady, and he said 4 words, "Now go earn it." That was the proudest moment of my life, and he expressed it in 4 words. That's the kind of family I come from. My first assignment was Naval Intelligence activity at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. I spent 2 years learning the machinery, how intelligence flowed from collection to analysis to action, how satellite imagery and signals intercepts and human reporting all fed into the same picture if you knew how to read it. I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade in 2013 and sent overseas intelligence support for 5th Fleet operations out of Bahrain. I was 24 years old, and I was briefing captains and commanders on threat assessments for the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody cared that I was young. Nobody cared that I was a woman. They cared that my assessments were right. And they were. In 2015, I was promoted to lieutenant and reassigned to Joint Special Operations Command's liaison element at Dam Neck, Virginia. Dam Neck is a naval facility that sits on the ocean front in Virginia Beach, and if you've never heard of it, that's by design. The work I did there was classified at levels I still can't describe. What I can tell you is this. I started working directly with SEAL teams, planning operations, running intelligence briefs, building targeting packages that would determine where operators went, what they did, and whether they came home. I was 26 years old, and the decisions I made in a windowless room affected lives on the other side of the world. I never got used to that weight. I just learned to carry it. I met Ryan Tanner in the summer of 2019 at a friend's cookout in Virginia Beach. He was 29, a software engineer for a defense contractor, civilian side, nothing classified. He had a sunburn and a crooked smile, and he was arguing with someone about whether a hot dog was a sandwich. I watched him for 10 minutes before I walked over. He asked me what I did. I said, Navy stuff. He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and said, "That's the most vague answer I've ever gotten, and I work in tech." We talked for 3 hours. He never circled back to what I did. He asked me what I read, what I cooked, whether I preferred the mountains or the beach. Nobody had asked me questions like that in years. I'd spent 8 years around people who only wanted to know my clearance level and my assessment. Ryan wanted to know if I liked Thai food. We started dating. It was easy in a way nothing in my life had been easy. He packed lunches for me when I had early briefs. He never asked why I left at 3 a.m. He just kissed me and said, "Be safe." He didn't need to understand my career to respect it. And after years of working with people who understood my career but didn't particularly care about me as a person, Ryan's simple kindness felt revolutionary. He told me once, sitting on his apartment balcony in Virginia Beach, "I don't need to know what you do. I just need to know you're coming home." I looked at him and thought, this is the person I want to come home to. Meeting his mother was different. Patricia Tanner was 60 at the time, a retired event coordinator from Richmond who ran her family's social calendar with the precision of a NATO exercise and the warmth of a January wind. She had opinions about everything: the restaurant we met at, the way I held my fork, the fact that I wore a plain watch instead of something that showed a little personality. She sat across from me at brunch in Richmond, with her napkin folded just so and her smile tight enough to crack porcelain, and within 5 minutes she asked the question. "So, Allison, what do you do?" "Intelligence work for the Navy," I said. She tilted her head. "Intelligence works, so like a secretary for the military." Ryan jumped in. "Mom, it's more than that." But Patricia was already waving her hand the way you wave away a fly. "I'm sure it's very important, dear," she said, and moved on to asking Ryan about Lauren. Lauren, his college girlfriend, the pediatrician, the one Patricia had picked for him 10 years ago and never stopped advertising. She brought up Lauren's new practice, Lauren's condo and short pump, Lauren's holiday party that the whole family was invited to. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Neither did I. On the drive home, I told Ryan it didn't bother me. It did. But I'd spent the last 4 years being underestimated by people who held clearances higher than Patricia Tanner's imagination. I could handle brunch. What I couldn't handle, though I didn't know it yet, was that brunch was just the beginning. Patricia Tanner had decided who I was the moment she saw me, and she would spend the next 4 years making sure everyone in her family agreed with her. Ryan proposed in the spring of 2021. A quiet evening on the Virginia Beach boardwalk, no audience, no photographers, just him and a ring in the ocean. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We planned a small wedding, 30 people, a beach ceremony, the kind of day that felt like us. We sent invitations 8 weeks in advance. Patricia received hers and said nothing for 2 days. Then she texted Ryan, "I wasn't given enough notice. You know how my schedule is." She didn't come. I stood on that beach in a white dress with sand between my toes, and I married the man I loved in front of his father, his brother, my parents, and a handful of friends. The ceremony was short and the vows were simple, and when it was over, Ryan's father, George, hugged me and said welcome to the family. There was an empty chair in the front row where Patricia was supposed to sit. I looked at it once, just once. Then I looked at Ryan, and I decided I would never look at that chair again. Our first Christmas as a married couple was at the Tanner house in Richmond. I walked in, expecting awkward. I got ambushed. Patricia had invited Lauren, Ryan's college ex-girlfriend, to the family Christmas party. Lauren was there with her boyfriend, but Patricia had seated her next to Ryan at the long table and put me at the far end with the cousins and an uncle I'd never met. Ryan didn't notice the seating arrangement until we sat down. I noticed immediately. I sat down anyway. I'd been trained to operate in hostile territory, and the Tanner family Christmas dinner was starting to qualify. The evening was fine on the surface, the way things are fine when everyone is performing. But I excused myself to refill my water glass, and as I stood in the kitchen doorway, I heard Patricia's voice carrying from the dining room. She was talking to Ryan's Aunt Carol, and she wasn't whispering. "No one is that secretive unless they're lying," Patricia said. "I've told Ryan she's not who she says she is. I've never trusted her. There's something off about that woman." Aunt Carol murmured something I couldn't hear. Patricia continued. "Lauren would never have been like this. Lauren was open. Lauren was warm. This one? She disappears for weeks, won't tell anyone what she's doing, and expects us to just accept it." I don't think so. I stood in that kitchen with a glass of water and 14 years of operational composure, and I did what I'd been trained to do. I processed the information, assessed the threat, and made a decision. The decision was to go back to the table, eat my dinner, and drive home. I didn't confront Patricia. I didn't tell Ryan what I'd heard. I went back to my seat between a cousin who sold insurance and an uncle who collected model trains, and I ate Christmas ham and smiled when people spoke to me. In the spring of 2022, I deployed on a 60-day temporary duty assignment I couldn't discuss. I told Ryan I'd be gone for 2 months. He understood, or at least he accepted it, which was the civilian version of understanding. He kissed me at the door and said, "Be safe," and didn't ask where I was going. Patricia called him that night. I didn't find this out until 6 months later from Jake's girlfriend Megan, who'd overheard it at a family gathering. "See?" Patricia had told Ryan. "A normal wife doesn't disappear for 2 months with no explanation. What is she doing? Who does that? Lauren never would have done this to you. Ryan never told me about the call. I think he thought he was protecting me, the way I thought not telling him about the Christmas conversation was protecting him. We were both wrong. Silence isn't protection, it's permission. And we'd been giving Patricia permission for years." Thanksgiving 2022 was the last holiday I spent in Patricia's house before everything broke apart. George made a toast at the head of the table. He raised his glass and thanked everyone by name: Patricia, Jake, Megan, Aunt Carol, Uncle Dean, the cousins. He skipped me. Not maliciously. George was a gentleman who simply followed the current of whatever his wife set in motion. And Patricia's current had been flowing around me, not toward me, for 2 years. Ryan squeezed my hand under the table. He didn't correct his father. He didn't add my name. He just squeezed, and I understood that the squeeze was supposed to mean something, but it didn't mean enough. After dinner, Patricia found me in the hallway outside the bathroom. She was carrying a dish towel and wearing the kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness. She said, "I hope you know I'm not trying to be difficult, Allison. I just want what's best for my son, and I'm not sure that's you." I looked at her. I opened my mouth to respond, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't have words. I had 14 years of words. 14 years of briefings and assessments and the kind of clarity that comes from making decisions in rooms where mistakes cost lives. But none of those words applied here. You can't outrank someone's mother. You can't brief your way out of a woman who decided you were wrong for her son before she ever learned your name. So I said nothing. I nodded once and walked past her and found Ryan's coat in the closet and said, "We need to go." We drove home in silence, not the comfortable silence of 2 people who don't need to fill the air, the suffocating silence of 2 people who have too much to say and no way to say it. The Virginia highway was dark and the headlights carved through nothing, and I sat in the passenger seat and watched the trees blur past, and I felt, for the first time since I joined the Navy, genuinely small. Patricia Tanner didn't outrank me. She didn't outwork me. She didn't outthink me. But she had something I'd never figured out how to fight. She had her son's silence. And as long as Ryan said nothing, Patricia could say anything. That was Thanksgiving 2022. I didn't go back to Richmond for a long time after that. In 2023, I was promoted to Commander. 05. I was 34 years old, and I was now in charge of the entire joint task force I'd entered as a lieutenant 8 years earlier. The same program, the same windowless rooms at Dam Neck, the same SEAL teams rotating through deployments that I planned from behind a classified screen. My commanding officer pinned the new rank on my collar in a small ceremony attended by 12 people, all of whom held clearances that don't have names on the outside. My father drove down from Annapolis. He shook my hand the same way he had 12 years earlier. "Still earning it," he said. I said, "Still earning it." That was enough. Ryan didn't come to the promotion ceremony, not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. The facility doesn't allow uncleared visitors past the lobby, and the ceremony was held inside a SCIF. I told him about it at dinner that night. He said he was proud of me. I believe he meant it. But there was a gap between meaning it and understanding it, and that gap was where Patricia's voice lived, telling him I was just a secretary, just a liar, just a woman who wasn't good enough. Ryan had never seen me in uniform in a professional context. He'd never seen me brief a room. He'd never seen a SEAL team leader wait for my assessment before planning a mission. He knew I was in the Navy. He didn't know what that meant. 2024 passed quietly. I worked. Ryan worked. We didn't go to Richmond for holidays. Patricia called Ryan every week, sometimes to guilt him, sometimes to cry, sometimes to drop Lauren's name like a grenade into an otherwise normal Tuesday. Ryan handled it the way he always had. He absorbed it, deflected the worst of it, and never told me the full scope. I knew anyway. You don't spend a decade reading intelligence signals without learning to read the ones in your own kitchen. Then Jake got engaged. Ryan's younger brother, 28, easygoing, a project manager at a construction firm in Norfolk, proposed to his girlfriend Megan in February of 2025. The wedding was set for April, and the rehearsal dinner was going to be at a waterfront restaurant in Virginia Beach. Jake called Ryan and asked us to come. Ryan looked at me when he hung up the phone. I could see the question in his face before he asked it. Will you do this? I said yes, because it was Jake's weekend, not Patricia's, and because I'd spent 2 years avoiding the Tanner family, and avoidance had started to feel less like a boundary and more like a surrender. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening in April. The restaurant sat on the water, white tablecloths, string lights on the patio, the Chesapeake Bay stretching out beyond the windows like a postcard someone had left unfinished. Ryan and I arrived at 6. I was wearing a navy blue dress, low heels, and the only piece of jewelry that mattered, my wedding ring on my left hand, and, on my right wrist, a tungsten bracelet. It was plain, narrow, dark gray. If you didn't know what it was, you'd think it was a fitness band or a fashion choice. But I knew what it was. Every person who'd served a full operational cycle in my task force wore one. It was the only thing we were allowed to carry outside the wire, a marker that said you'd been there, you'd done the work, and you'd earned the right to wear it. I never took it off. We walked in. I saw the seating chart immediately. Patricia had placed herself next to Ryan at the center of the table. She'd placed me at the far end, between an uncle I'd met once and a cousin of Megan's I'd never met at all. A table's length between me and my husband. I didn't react. I'd been trained in environments where reacting to provocation was the fastest way to lose. I walked to my seat, pulled out my chair, and sat down. Jake stood up to introduce the wedding party. He was grinning, the kind of grin that comes from being 28 and in love, and not yet understanding that families are complicated. He pointed around the table. Megan's maid of honor, her college roommate Steph, his groomsmen, 2 guys from work, a friend from high school. And then he put his hand on the shoulder of the man sitting 2 seats from me. And this is Cole, Jake said. My roommate from Virginia Tech, the best man, and the reason I survived sophomore year. Cole Bradshaw stood up and waved. Mid-30s, fit, square jaw, easy confidence, the kind of posture that comes from years of physical discipline. He was wearing a sport coat and an open-collared shirt, and he looked like every off-duty operator I'd ever seen. Comfortable in civilian clothes, but not quite at home in them. Something about him felt familiar. The angle of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved across the room without settling, but I couldn't place it. We shook hands across the table. His grip was firm. He said, "Nice to meet you." I said the same. Neither of us knew. Dinner started. The food came. Conversations layered over each other, Jake's college stories, Megan's bridesmaids laughing, George telling a golf anecdote to nobody in particular. I ate my salad and talked to Megan's cousin about her job in real estate and tried to ignore the fact that Patricia was watching me from the center of the table with the focus of a targeting laser. 3 glasses of wine into the evening, Patricia started, small at first, the way she always started. Allison, you're so quiet, as usual. Then to Ryan, loud enough for half the table. Remember how Lauren used to light up a room? She had this energy about her. Ryan's jaw tightened. George coughed into his napkin. Jake glanced at me and looked away. Then George stood up. He raised his glass. I want to toast Jake and Megan, he said. I'm proud of both my sons and the wonderful partners they've found." He looked at Megan. He looked at me. He nodded. It was small, but it was there, the first time George had explicitly included me in a family moment. Patricia set down her glass. I saw her face change. The wine had lowered the wall she usually kept between her resentment and her public persona. And George's toast, George, including me, pushed her past whatever line she'd been standing behind. She stood up. The table went quiet. Not slowly, immediately. The way a room goes quiet when someone pulls a fire alarm. "Get her out of here!" She was pointing at me. Her hand was shaking. Her voice was loud enough to reach the tables around us. "Before she ruins everything. She has no business being at this table. She's not part of this family. She never has been. She's secretive, she's cold, and I am done pretending she belongs here." Nobody moved. Ryan's face went white. George reached for Patricia's arm, and she shook him off. Jake's mouth was open. Megan's hand was over hers. The restaurant was silent, that specific awful silence where strangers pretend not to hear something they'll never forget. I sat perfectly still. My hands were flat on the table. My breathing was even. I'd sat through intelligence briefs where the wrong word could redirect a strike package. I'd sat in rooms where the tension was measured in aircraft carriers and the consequences were measured in lives. Patricia Tanner screaming at me over white tablecloths and string lights was not going to break my posture. I looked straight ahead. I didn't blink. And then I heard a fork stop. 2 seats to my left, Cole Bradshaw had been staring at his water glass. Embarrassed for the family, I think. Trying to disappear into the moment the way a guest does when someone else's relatives are falling apart. But in the silence after Patricia's outburst, he looked up. He looked at me. Really looked, the way an operator looks at a target package. The way you look at something when your brain is telling you it's important and you haven't figured out why yet. His eyes moved to my right wrist, to the tungsten bracelet. I saw the recognition land, not all at once, in layers. The bracelet, then my face, the jaw, the eyes, the pixelated figure on a classified video feed at 0300 in a SCIF at Dam Neck. The voice that had come through his headset in Syria saying, "Overwatch has eyes, you are clear to move." The voice that redirected his element out of a kill zone in Somalia. "Abort North Corridor, threat signature confirmed, reroute to extraction point Charlie." The voice he'd heard for 2 deployments and never attached to a face. His fork stopped, his jaw tightened. Something shifted behind his eyes, the precise moment a SEAL operator connects a classified memory to a civilian setting and the worlds collide. He pushed his chair back. Slowly, the legs scraped against the restaurant floor. He stood. The table watched him. Patricia was still standing, still shaking, still waiting for someone to agree with her. Nobody was looking at her anymore. Cole straightened his posture, shoulders square, chin level, eyes locked on mine. The transformation was instant. 1 second he was a groomsman at a rehearsal dinner. The next he was a naval officer in a room with a superior. "With all due respect, Mrs. Tanner." His voice was calm, controlled. The kind of calm that comes from years of operating in environments where volume is a liability. He turned to me. "Commander, I had no idea." He saluted. Full, crisp, deliberate. His hand came up like it was pulled by a wire. The kind of salute you don't practice because you've done it 10,000 times and it lives in your muscle memory like breathing. The kind of salute you give to someone who kept you alive from the other side of a screen and you never got to stand in front of them and do it properly. Patricia's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The entire table was frozen. Ryan was looking at Cole, then at me, then back at Cole, and I could see it happening in real time. The recalibration, the 4 years of his mother's narrative collapsing in the space between one breath and the next. His wife, the woman his mother had called a secretary, a liar, a woman who wasn't good enough. A Navy SEAL was standing at attention and saluting her in a restaurant in Virginia Beach. I held Cole's gaze for a long moment, then I said quietly, "At ease." He dropped the salute. He sat back down. He didn't explain to the table who I was or what Overwatch meant. He picked up his water glass and said, to nobody in particular, "Your daughter-in-law is someone I respect more than almost anyone I've served with. That's all I'll say." The silence held for another 10 seconds. Then George cleared his throat, raised his glass again, and said, "To Jake and Megan." People drank. Conversations resumed, slowly, carefully, the way traffic restarts after an accident. Patricia gathered her purse from the back of her chair without a word. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Ryan. She walked out of the restaurant and nobody went after her. I think that was the first time in the history of the Tanner family that nobody chased Patricia. I went back to my salmon. I finished my dinner. Ryan sat at the other end of the table and watched me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Something between awe and shame, and the kind of love that comes after a wall breaks down and you finally see the person who was standing behind it the whole time. We drove home. Ryan's hands were tight on the steering wheel and the car was quiet for 5 minutes. Not the suffocating silence of Thanksgiving 2022. A different kind, the silence of a man whose entire understanding of his wife had just been rebuilt in 45 seconds by a stranger in a sport coat. "Allie," he said, "what just happened?" I told him what I could, that I ran intelligence operations that supported SEAL teams, that Cole Bradshaw was one of the operators I'd worked with, that the bracelet on my wrist was from a unit I couldn't name, that I'd spent the last 10 years in a world I wasn't allowed to bring home with me, and so I hadn't. I couldn't tell him more. Not because I didn't want to, because the classification wouldn't let me. Some walls aren't built by silence, they're built by law. He was quiet for a long time, then he asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" "You never asked," I said, "and your mother made sure I never wanted to." He flinched. I didn't mean it as a weapon, I meant it as the truth. And the truth is that I had spent 4 years married to a man who loved me and never once pushed past the surface of what I did, because his mother had built a narrative so loud that it filled every room we walked into. Patricia didn't need to know the truth about me, she just needed to talk louder than it. Ryan didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. When we pulled into our driveway, he turned off the engine and sat there. Then he said, "I should have said something a long time ago. Not because of your rank, because she was wrong, and I knew it, and I sat there. I looked at him. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. But I put my hand on his, and I said, 'You're saying something now.'" We sat in the dark car in our driveway, and I let the silence between us be something new, not heavy, not suffocating, but open. The kind of silence that comes after something finally breaks and you realize the breaking was the point. The next morning, I sat on the back porch of our house in Virginia Beach with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and called my father in Annapolis. He answered on the second ring. He always did. I told him what happened, the rehearsal dinner, Patricia's outburst, Cole's salute. He listened without interrupting. My father was the kind of man who understood that listening was its own form of intelligence collection. When I finished, there was a long pause. I could hear the morning birds on his end, the Annapolis waterfront, the same birds I'd woken up to for 18 years. "Allie," he said, "you've spent 14 years earning respect from people who matter. Stop waiting for it from people who don't." One sentence. That's all he said. Then he told me he was proud of me, the same way he always told me, like it was a fact, not a feeling, and he hung up. I sat on the porch and watched the sun come up over the backyard and let his words settle into me the way intelligence settles into an assessment. Slowly at first, then all at once, until you can't believe you didn't see it before. I'd spent 4 years trying to earn Patricia Tanner's approval. Not because I needed it, but because I thought Ryan needed me to. And the truth was simpler than that. Ryan didn't need me to win his mother over. He needed me to stop shrinking, and I needed me to stop shrinking too. Later that afternoon, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He'd been quiet all day, not withdrawn, but processing. The kind of quiet that happens when someone is reorganizing their understanding of their own life. He told me he'd spent the morning reading about the Navy, about Naval Intelligence, about what commanders do and what dam neck is and what it means when someone earns a classified operational bracelet. He didn't understand all of it. The world I worked in didn't translate neatly into civilian language, but he understood enough. "I looked it up," he said. "What a Navy commander is, what intelligence officers do. I don't know the details and I know you can't tell me, but I understand enough to know this. You outrank almost everyone I've ever met, and my mother has been calling you a secretary for 4 years. I didn't say anything. He looked up from his laptop. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not for her. For me. For sitting in rooms where she said those things and not standing up. For letting the silence be easier than the fight. For 4 years of choosing peace with my mother over truth with my wife. I sat down across from him. I took his hand. The fight isn't with your mother, I said. The fight was always about whether you believed her. And I think you just answered that. He nodded. His eyes were wet, which was rare for Ryan. He wasn't a crier, and neither was I. We sat at the kitchen table in a silence that was nothing like the Thanksgiving drive or the Christmas dinner or any of the heavy, airless silences that had followed us through 2 years of Patricia's campaign. This silence was clean. This silence was the sound of something cracking open. Jake's wedding was the next day. We went. Of course we went. It was Jake's day, and whatever had happened at the rehearsal dinner didn't belong in his ceremony. The wedding was at a garden venue in Virginia Beach. White chairs on green grass, an arch covered in pale flowers. Megan walked down the aisle, and Jake's face did the thing that faces do when the person you love is walking toward you, and everything else in the world stops mattering. I cried. Not a lot, just enough to fog my vision for a moment. Ryan reached over and held my hand. Patricia was in the front row. She wore a cream-colored suit and a fixed smile, and she didn't look at me once. I was 3 rows back with Ryan. We didn't speak to her. She didn't speak to us. George sat between his wife and the aisle, and when he turned around to check on Ryan before the ceremony started, he gave me a small nod. I nodded back. That was enough. Cole gave the best man's toast. It was warm and funny, stories about Jake's disastrous cooking in their Virginia tech apartment. A joke about the time Jake tried to build a desk from an online kit and ended up with a shelf. He didn't mention the rehearsal dinner. He didn't mention me. He was a professional. He understood that the rehearsal dinner wasn't his story to tell, and the wedding wasn't the place to tell it. During the reception, I was standing at the bar waiting for a glass of wine when I felt someone step up beside me. Cole. He was holding a bourbon, his tie loosened, his posture slightly less rigid than it had been the night before. "Commander," he said. Quiet, just for me. I looked at him. "Allie," I said. "Tonight I'm just Allie." He nodded. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I briefed my entire platoon about you after that Somalia redirect. The night your intelligence package rerouted us from that north corridor, we were 60 seconds from walking into a confirmed ambush. Every man on my element is alive because of what you saw on that screen. None of us would be here without Overwatch." I didn't know what to say. In the classified world, you don't get thanked. You get debriefed. You get assessed. You get a line on a fitness report that says, "Demonstrated superior tactical acumen," and you move on to the next operation. Nobody walks up to you at a wedding and tells you that you saved their life. Nobody buys you a drink and says the quiet part out loud. "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know." He tapped his glass against mine. "Enjoy the wedding, Allie." He walked away. That was the last time we discussed it. Some things don't need more than one conversation. The week after the wedding, I sat down with Ryan in our living room and told him my decision. I wasn't going to attend Tanner family events until Patricia acknowledged what happened at the rehearsal dinner. Not an apology. I'd learned long enough ago that demanding apologies from people who don't believe they've done anything wrong is an exercise in futility. Just an acknowledgement. That she stood up in a restaurant full of people and screamed at me to leave. That she told a room full of strangers and family that I didn't belong. That it happened. I wasn't asking for remorse. I was asking for reality. Ryan nodded. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask me to reconsider. He said, "I'll tell her." This was the first time in 4 years of marriage that Ryan had chosen my side without a pause, without a caveat, without a, "but she's my mother," softening the edge. Something had changed in him at that rehearsal dinner, not because of Cole's salute, but because of what the salute revealed. The gap between who his mother said I was and who I actually was had become too wide to stand in. He'd fallen to one side. He fell to mine. Patricia called Ryan 3 times that week. I know because I was in the house for all 3 calls, and I could hear her voice through the phone even when he walked into the other room. The first call, she cried. She said I was punishing her, that she'd just been emotional, that the wine had gotten to her. Ryan held firm. The second call, she was angry. She said I was manipulating him, isolating him from his family, that this was exactly what she'd warned him about. Ryan held firm. The third call, she played the guilt card. the heaviest weapon in her arsenal. She told Ryan his father was heartbroken, that Jake was upset, that I was tearing the family apart and Ryan was letting me do it. "She's turning you against your own family, Ryan," she said. "That's what she does. She's a manipulator." Ryan said, "Mom, she's not turning me against anyone. She asked for one thing. You know what it is." He hung up. He looked tired. I could see what it cost him, not the argument, but the grief of realizing that his mother might never meet him where he needed her to. Patricia Tanner had spent 63 years being right about everything in her family. The rehearsal dinner was the first time she'd been publicly, undeniably, catastrophically wrong, and she was choosing to rewrite it rather than face it. I understood that instinct. I'd seen it in intelligence work. The hardest thing about a bad assessment isn't the error, it's the refusal to acknowledge it. People will burn down entire operations before they'll admit they misread the data. I didn't tell Ryan what to do about his mother. That wasn't my call to make. I told him, "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to not let her pretend it didn't happen. That's the boundary. Everything else is between you and her." George called me directly a few days later. It was the first time my father-in-law had ever called me. His voice was careful, the voice of a man navigating between his wife of 35 years and a daughter-in-law he'd only recently begun to see clearly. "Allison," he said, "I know she went too far. I told her that. I'm asking, is there a way back from this?" "There is," I said. "She knows what it is." He was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed, a deep, exhausted sigh that carried 30 years of standing next to Patricia and choosing the path of least resistance. "I'll try," he said. I thanked him and hung up and stood in my kitchen and understood, from the weight of that sigh, that Patricia Tanner had never once in her life admitted she was wrong. And George Tanner had never once asked her to. I wasn't sure which of those patterns was about to break first, or if either of them would. Summer came. The boundary held. Ryan and I didn't go to Richmond for the 4th of July, the first time in the Tanners' family history that Ryan had missed his mother's annual party. Patricia told the guests I was going through something and that Ryan was being supportive. She reframed my absence as fragility, as if the woman who'd coordinated SEAL operations across 3 theaters was too delicate to handle a family barbecue. George didn't play along. When Aunt Carol asked where Ryan was, George just said, "They couldn't make it," and walked to the other end of the yard. Patricia noticed. I know because Megan told me everything. She'd become the quiet bridge between our house in Virginia Beach and the Tanner family orbit, passing information without commentary, keeping me connected without forcing reconciliation. Megan told me something else that summer. She said Jake talked about the rehearsal dinner more than he let on. That watching Cole salute me at that table had changed something in how Jake saw his own family. He'd grown up in the same house Ryan had, same mother, same patterns, same permission structure, where Patricia's behavior was absorbed rather than addressed. But seeing a Navy SEAL stand at attention for the woman his mother had been calling a secretary, that cracked something in Jake that couldn't be uncracked. He didn't say it to Patricia. He said it to Megan, late at night, in the way people say things when they're rearranging their understanding of their own childhood. Ryan was changing too. Not dramatically, not the kind of change that announces itself, but steadily, the way a current shifts. He called his mother once a week instead of 3 times. He stopped relaying her guilt trips to me. He started asking me about my work, not the classified details, which he knew I couldn't share, but the shape of my days. How was the brief this morning? How's the team? He brought me coffee when I came home late from Dam Neck. He read about Naval Intelligence on his own time, not to understand my specific work, but to understand the world I lived in. One evening in August, we were sitting on the back porch with takeout Thai food and the sunset painting the yard orange and gold. He set his chopsticks down and said, "I think I spent 4 years married to you without actually knowing you. Not because you hid, because I didn't look. That's on me." I looked at him. "You're looking now," I said. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Ryan didn't become a different person. He became the person he'd always been, just without his mother's voice in the background telling him who I was. Without that noise, he could hear me, and hearing me changed everything. That same month, I received a handwritten letter at Dam Neck. It was routed through official channels, addressed to Commander Hansen, my maiden name, which is what I used professionally. The return address was a training command in Coronado, California. I opened it in my office, alone, with the door closed. It was from Cole. His handwriting was precise and small, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who fills out operational reports in the field and doesn't waste ink on extra words. He wrote that after the rehearsal dinner, he'd gone back to his hotel and called his wife. He told her what happened, not the classified details, but the shape of it. That the woman sitting at that table, the one her mother-in-law was screaming at, was the intelligence officer who'd run his operations for 2 deployments. That in Somalia, her redirect had pulled his element out of a kill zone with 60 seconds to spare. That he'd heard her voice through static at 0300 hours and followed it without hesitation, because Overwatch had never been wrong. He told his wife that he'd spent 7 years carrying that night in Mogadishu, and that knowing it was her, knowing she was sitting at a rehearsal dinner being treated like she was nothing, he couldn't stay seated. The letter ended with one line. I hope I didn't overstep, but some salutes are owed whether the uniform is on or not. I read it twice. I folded it. I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk at Dam Neck, a classified facility holding classified things, and now holding the most personal piece of recognition I'd ever received. Cole Bradshaw's letter wasn't long. Operators aren't wordy. But that one line, I couldn't stay seated, said everything about who he was and everything about what my mother-in-law had missed. Fall came, and the air in Virginia Beach turned cool, and the leaves on the oak trees in our neighborhood went amber, and I was selected for a new billet. A senior intelligence position at the Pentagon, a lateral move in rank, but a vertical leap in responsibility. I'd be briefing flag officers, coordinating across agencies, working in rooms where the decisions shaped policy, not just operations. My commanding officer at Dam Neck, a captain named Reeves who'd spent 30 years in intelligence and didn't give compliments unless they were earned, told me I was the strongest officer he'd nominated in 15 years. I thanked him. He said, don't thank me, just don't make me wrong. Ryan took me to dinner to celebrate. A quiet restaurant on Atlantic Avenue, the ocean audible through the windows. He ordered champagne, which he never did. He asked if I was nervous. I said I'd been nervous before. This wasn't it. This was ready. Nervous and ready feel almost identical. The only difference is whether you trust yourself. I'd spent 14 years learning to trust myself. The Pentagon was just the next room. Jake called Ryan a few weeks later and asked if we were coming to Thanksgiving in Richmond. Ryan said he didn't know. Jake said Patricia had been different lately, not softer exactly, but quieter, less combative. She hadn't mentioned Lauren in months. She hadn't badmouthed me to anyone that Jake knew of. George confirmed the same in a separate call. Patricia was quieter. Something was shifting. But quiet and changed aren't the same thing. Quiet just means someone stopped talking. Changed means they started listening. I told Ryan I wasn't sure which one Patricia was doing, and I didn't want to walk into another performance. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my phone rang. The screen said, Patricia Tanner. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the decline button for 3 rings. On the 4th ring, I picked up. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing. Then, I was wrong about you. 5 words, no elaboration, no excuse, no, but you have to understand, or I was just emotional, or any of the qualifiers I'd been bracing for. Just, I was wrong about you. I stood in my kitchen and let those words land. 4 years. 4 years of being called a secretary, a liar, a woman who wasn't good enough. 4 years of empty chairs and seating charts and whispered campaigns, and Lauren's name dropped like a weapon at every gathering. 4 years of silence from Ryan, and complicity from George, and isolation from a family that had decided who I was without ever asking. And now, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, Patricia Tanner had said 5 words that cracked the wall she'd spent 4 years building. Thank you for saying that, I said. She cleared her throat. Will you come to Thanksgiving? I'll talk to Ryan, I said. She said okay. I said goodbye. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I don't know what changed in Patricia, whether George finally wore her down or the loneliness did, or whether she simply got tired of being the villain in her own family's story. Maybe she saw the empty chairs at her own table and recognized the feeling. Maybe Cole's salute haunted her the way it haunted all of us. The inescapable evidence that the woman she'd dismissed was someone a Navy SEAL stood at attention for. I don't know. I didn't ask. The why didn't matter as much as the words. She said them. I heard them. And after 4 years, that was enough to open a door. Ryan and I drove to Richmond on Thanksgiving morning. The highway was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from everyone already being where they're going. Ryan held my hand over the center console. Neither of us said much. I watched the trees thin out as we crossed into the city, the same trees I'd watched blur past on the drive home from Thanksgiving 2022, the night I'd felt small. I didn't feel small now. I wasn't sure what I felt, but the heaviness was gone. The shrinking was gone. The feeling that I needed to earn my seat at a table I'd been dragged away from, that was gone too. The last time I drove this highway toward Patricia Tanner's house, I was trying to disappear. This time, I was just trying to show up. That's the difference a boundary makes. You stop shrinking and start arriving. We pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same, brick, colonial, black shutters, Patricia's chrysanthemums lining the front walk. Ryan squeezed my hand. I took a breath. We got out. George met us at the door. He hugged Ryan first, then me, a real hug, the kind that means something. Jake and Megan were already inside. The house smelled like turkey and rosemary and something cinnamon that Patricia baked every year. I could hear Megan laughing in the kitchen. Patricia came out of the kitchen. She was wearing an apron and her hair was pulled back and she looked older than I remembered, not physically, but in her eyes. Tired in a way that goes beyond sleep. She walked up to me. She didn't rush. She didn't make a speech. She held out a glass of wine, red, which is what I drink, and said, "I'm glad you came." I took the glass. "Thank you," I said. That was it. No grand reconciliation, no tearful embrace, no hallmark moment where the music swells and everyone cries and the credits roll, just 2 women in a doorway, one of them finally making room. I didn't need more than that. I'd never needed more than that. I just needed to not be pushed out. Dinner was quiet and imperfect. George sat at the head of the table. Patricia sat at the other end. Ryan and I sat side by side, not at opposite ends, not separated by a seating chart, but together. Jake said grace. It was simple and sincere, and he stumbled over the last line, and everyone laughed. Megan squeezed my arm under the table. The food was passed, conversations were easy, Jake's new project at work, Megan's sister's baby, George's golf game, the weather. Nobody mentioned the rehearsal dinner. Nobody mentioned Lauren. Nobody mentioned any of it. The absence of hostility isn't the same as warmth, but it's the foundation warmth is built on. And I could feel it being laid, board by board, in every small moment where Patricia looked at me and didn't look away. After dinner, I helped clear the table. I was alone in the kitchen rinsing plates when Patricia walked in. She picked up a dish towel and stood next to me at the sink. We worked side by side in silence for a minute, me washing, her drying. The rhythm was domestic and ordinary, and it was the closest we'd ever been to something normal. Then she said, without looking up, "George told me about the man at the rehearsal dinner, the one who saluted you." I kept rinsing. "Yes," I said. She was quiet. Then, "I didn't know." I set the plate down. I looked at her. "You didn't want to know." She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just nodded, a small, tired nod that carried more honesty than 4 years of words. I picked the plate back up and kept rinsing. She kept drying. We didn't say anything else. That was as close to resolution as Patricia Tanner and I would ever get. A kitchen, a sink, and 2 women finally standing next to each other instead of across from each other. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. It was something more practical than either of those things. It was a beginning. Ryan and I drove back to Virginia Beach in the dark. The highway was empty, and the car was warm, and the radio was playing something soft that neither of us was really listening to. Ryan reached over and held my hand and said, "I'm proud of you." I looked at him. "For what?" "Not for any of the Navy stuff," he said. "For walking back in there." I leaned my head against the window and watched the highway lights pass. I thought about Cole's salute, the crisp, deliberate recognition of a man who knew what I'd done and couldn't stay seated while someone pretended I'd done nothing. I thought about my father's one sentence, "Stop waiting for it from people who don't," and how it had taken me 4 years to understand that the people who don't aren't failures of mine, they're facts of life. I thought about the empty chair at my wedding and the full chair at Thanksgiving. I thought about Patricia's nod in the kitchen, that small, exhausted surrender that wasn't an apology but was, somehow, enough. I thought about all the years I'd spent being quiet, carrying weight no one could see, planning operations in windowless rooms, and coming home to a family that thought I typed emails for a living. And I realized that the loudest thing I ever did had nothing to do with the Navy. It wasn't the intelligence packages or the targeting cycles or the 2 deployments where my voice in someone's headset was the difference between coming home and not. The loudest thing I ever did was set down a boundary and hold it to say, without shouting, that I deserved to be seen. Not as a commander, not as Overwatch, not as the woman a SEAL saluted at a rehearsal dinner. Just as Allie, just as myself. And for the first time in 4 years, that was enough. If you've ever sat at a table where someone decided who you were before they ever asked, I know that feeling, 4 years of it. And I'll tell you this, the moment I stopped trying to earn Patricia's approval was the moment I started getting it. Funny how that works. I want to know, have you ever had someone in your family completely misjudge what you do for a living? Or have you ever had a stranger defend you when your own family wouldn't? Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. And if this story hit home, subscribe.